It's as if getting out of the center with my king is speeding up the activity around my queen. Though maybe that's only a kind of character. Maybe that's an evaluation we give because white is just castled and thus a rook. Looking down the e file is more rapid. The first move in the sequence, king castles and then rook e1 has been played, which gets a heavy piece looking at a file that's adjacent to my queen. My queen's position in sequences of moves has reduced. There is, prior to this move, there's an in number, an in move sequence prior to which white can involve my queen in a line. What do I mean? There's an in move sequence, the minimum move sequence, and I suppose that would be bishop b6. Yes. Okay, bishop b6 is the minimum sequence. That sequence has been on the board for a while. White has declined the opportunity to play bishop b6. Okay, but in each case, if we posed the question, what are the sequences that involve black responding correctly and black making a queen move, or black making a recapture, or making a capture? How rapidly can white draw black's queen into activity? Well, and then there are these sort of dead ends where this involves the queen, maybe, or I might take with the pawn and then I didn't move the queen. But a dead end, it's a dead end every move unless white, well, and that wouldn't be an example either because this doesn't allow bishop b6. One gestures towards the idea that you could support bishop to b6. But this at any rate, playing to a5 would not do that. Okay, well, and after castling, there's a routing where you force this pawn out of the way, and then you impale the rook on the position. Now, that would also be a dead end until you get rook support. So we would be adding Tempe, you'd have to get off the back rank and then put some other heavy piece behind the rook before this became tactically feasible. Okay, so I guess there's a clear sense in which rook e1, or castles rather, is preparation for, or is speeding up, reducing the time to queen metric, time to queen pressure metric. But then I want to say the same is true if I castle. This is also reducing the time to queen metric. This is reducing the time to queen, which means time to apply pressure. Number of moves before white can apply pressure to black's queen, which we can try to objectify by selecting lines, just any determined line by white in which black is recapturing with the queen or is forced to move the queen. Okay, so the time to queening has shortened. Time to queen pressure has shortened because this is the first move in a line, in a class of lines, I guess, that can apply pressure to the queen. And this would be like if black played through to rook e1, rook takes on e8, now queen takes on e8. And now, according to the principles, this would be bad to have the queen recapturing, but also according to the position, because the other rook could arrive on e1, claiming a tempo against the queen with development. So this would be the kind of particular instance where this time to queen metric would be relevant for analysis. Okay, but in the abstract, well, it's not exactly in the abstract. This is a good line, or ideally it would be a good line. It's not going to be because I'm going to have so much peace support from my own camp, but this is what you'd want to be a good line. Okay, but what does that mean? I'm getting a little bit too abstract here for myself. Let me think. You want this to be a good line. As an example, alright, well, as an example of a good line, as opposed to a determined line, that terminology we utilized earlier. A determined line. White insists on applying pressure to the queen. And now, for that matter, if rook e1 and I place the rook on e8 to prevent you from pressuring the queen somehow, you could still take the rook and then queen recaptures. Though, for that matter, the rook on h8 is also, or rather, the rook on f8 would also be covering e8 to deny rook e8, which would require queen takes. Okay, but if I don't choose... So a determined line is where I specify an objective and I bring it about. But what do I mean by an objective? I mean, I specify that there is a line in which black has to make a queen move, or will make a queen move when playing correctly. Okay, but practically what that means... It means... So that's like a criterion for me to sift through lines. Instead of looking at the good lines for white, I would look at the lines where an objective obtains, or where white obtains an objective. Okay, now that isn't good chess, and yet I want to use it for analysis. How am I using it for analysis? I'm saying that the time... Well, I'm saying that the time to queen metric is useful even though the way we characterize it is not useful. The way we characterize it is by specifying an objective that white can obtain. White doesn't want to obtain this. But okay, we can specify this objective of time to queen pressure. And we're saying, even though it would be bad chess to apply pressure to my queen, I still want to use this time to queen pressure metric. As it happens, this bad line that starts with rook e1 and involves impaling the rook on the queen uselessly is also the first move in the sequence of black castling and then playing rook e8, where rook takes rook is at worst a mediocre move. And yet it wasn't good chess that brought my attention to rook taking on e8. What brought my attention to this was thinking about time to queen pressure, and how castling and then rook e1 shortens or reduces this metric value, decrements this metric value, by pushing us one move deeper into lines, into sequences that involve playing rook e8. So in any sequence where rook arrives on e8, I could trace my steps backward and say somewhere in the line was where castling occurred, somewhere in the line is where rook e1 occurred, and these were two expenditures of tempi that brought us closer to this outcome of rook arriving on e8. Okay, now, so there's a clear sense in which this is reducing the time to queen pressure metric. And I want to say this is also reducing the time to queen pressure metric. With the idea that the analogy that came to mind was gravity. Like, the king being in the center in addition to the queen keeps everything slower. Well, I am thinking, in part, this is because I would make minor piece moves to decline moving my heavy pieces. I mean that if both the king and the queen are still in the center and a rook starts looking down the file, moving the pieces away only solves the problem for one of the pieces. So rather than moving the pieces away, I want to make another minor piece move that prevents me from having to make a slow or impulsive decision with the heavy pieces. When I castle, I reduce the time to queen pressure metric because now along that reasoning we just developed, I'm more likely to want to move the queen than to want to move a minor piece. If I was back here with the king still in the center, and now I have to put a knight, I have to respond to the rook pressure, then I can be making a minor piece move. Though I'm limited in my options for that. Maybe knight f8 into bishop e6 into king f7, into king g8 into bishop f7. So the two heavy pieces, so it's like gravity, whatever that means. It's like gravity in that the weight of these two pieces is making minor piece activity more active around. Yeah, how is that like gravity? Like the minor pieces are revolving around the heavy pieces in the center. Whereas after I split the heavy pieces, I'm more likely to move the queen than to move them. I'm more likely to move the queen than I was before I castled. What is likelihood in this context, though? Like, what is our metric, our unit of probability for this likelihood discussion? 8 point here, one of the stimuli for moving the queen is needing to move, so you move the queen to provide a point of defense to a piece. One of the motivations. So in the last case, white makes a minor piece move, or even a rook move, applies a point of pressure, and the queen answers it. And what observation am I making? The queen moves to answer the last point of pressure. Well, hopefully it's the last point, because if it's not the last point of pressure white is applying, then you either moved your queen early, so that you still have minor piece moves that solve problems, and you made them after you moved the queen to solve that problem. So white applies a rook at the end state, and now you defend with the queen. Then there's another point of pressure, and then you defend with a knight. But okay, then surely, often you could have spent the knight tempo first to provide the first point of defense, and then rather than using the queen to supply the second point of defense, you could either use a piece or a pawn, and thereby avoid developing the queen for another problem, for another circuit. Though, one point here, white applies a point of rook pressure, and then black plays 2 minor piece moves. As if we're specifying a trade-off where rather than one tempo later, black defends with the queen, one tempo earlier, black defends with 2 minor pieces. Or a pawn. And the idea is that if you can select a configuration of minor pieces that solves the imminent problem, then you complete another circuit before you have to commit to a heavy piece move. And that circuit, whatever I mean by that, that circuit has however many moves you can maintain. The idea is that the minor pieces configure together in such a way that I can keep spending Tempi resolving problems using the minor pieces, and then I retain the option to use a heavy piece tempo whenever white runs out of ways to force me to reconfigure my minor pieces. In a way, castling immediately is a kind of base example here. I mean that white has not compelled me to reconfigure my minor pieces to respond to an imminent problem, which means I have a spare tempo in which to develop a heavy piece. Alternatively, I could spend a tempo on a minor piece, e.g. Now white spends a tempo on a heavy piece, though there is an overwhelming amount of pressure against e5. I am thinking. I'm still not in a rush, though I'm not looking for a minor piece move. I mean, the moves that seem most aesthetically pleasing at the moment are Queen c7, castles kingside. Okay, rather than making a minor piece move. Hmm. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, otherwise knight's passing through h7. Or still king d7. Hmm. It's sort of forcing my king to f7, though maybe I'm not unhappy about that. Makes f takes e5 more playable. So it goes up knight d4. Try to get an earlier f5. Hmm. maybe the idea of king development is that it turns the king into a minor piece. I mean, that we were talking about castling as speeding up the activity around the queen, which we attributed this speeding up of the game around the queen to the unwillingness of black to commit to lengthy minor piece chains, lengthy minor piece lines, if all they did was keep the queen from moving, whereas black would be willing to commit to longer minor piece chains if it allowed both the king and the queen to remain stationary. So that castling took the incentive away to stabilize the center using minor pieces. Whereas, if I embark on a king development operation, it's like I'm turning the king into a minor piece, and we keep the categorization that the heavy pieces move after the minor pieces. But in this salient sense that if I'm embarking on a king development operation, this shifts activity away from my queen, I am thinking. Going on a king development operation suggests to white to reorder development against black's king specifically. So black's king becomes a target, black's queen remains free to move. Yeah, that's probably the more critical point at the moment. We can't stop that. Or the knight development needs to be directed towards stopping that, but also this immediately. Yeah, and then forced trades. This is a bad line with which to be making this observation. No, wait, hold on. You don't have the bishop support. You can't play that. Yeah, you have to play it like here. Now I spend a tempo on knight development, because if you use this, well, both this supports the advance. I can't play it though. Well, maybe I could. The objective, after all, is to win. Yeah, but if we give up the diagonal, we can't castle. I might prefer this line. And now the claim is king f8 through g7. Otherwise, we say that this is persuasive. Well, here, through g7 is fine, I think. You give up this point of pressure and you can't get it back. And then king g7 with or without knight g6. Maybe preserve for knight f5. We already have counter-kicking pawn here so that the bishop can defend the counter-kicking pawn, maybe. And then with bishop recapture, like if you make piece trade on h5 and then bishop stops the advance, which means that the knight on f5 is more secure. You'd have to use a piece. Which at minimum would complete king development while removing, or continue king development while removing material from the board, making king development more salutary. I doubt that works. Though if you use the knight, I draw back and then I go back to king g7, I suppose. Though towards what end did we trade off these pieces? A cheap operation. Speculative. that there's a phrase when I was actively commentating live games. A phrase I would often use is "with the pawns in front," or "with the pawn in front," which would typically be a description of the knight and its corresponding bishop pawn, where you are behind the pawn because you've had the tempo and the necessary space to advance the pawn prior to developing the knight. And now there's an accusation that I'm giving white too many pawn moves, that white should instead be developing the pieces, but I want to say that white is developing the pieces, that this is like a closed circuit. White is trying to accomplish what could have been a one-move development option of bishop c4. White is trying to accomplish this development option under more favorable circumstances, particularly because bishop c4 will block the c pawn, so if you commit to bishop c4, you have to move the bishop again before you can advance c. Okay, why the knight? Why don't you advance immediately? Or for that matter, why don't you immediately play b4? With the supposition that a knight on c3 will inevitably facilitate this operation, this construction on the queen side, in some as yet unknown way. So we won't say, if we'd been faster, we could have made this advance, as it were, or as in the case where we take back the knight move and replace it with one that instead prepares this advance. If the knight move does prepare this advance in some line, if the knight being here is critical for making the advance, then this was a preparation move for that line, as in retracing our steps. We could look back and say this knight move was the first in a dotable sequence, the first in a condensable sequence where I construct the advance. With the obvious point here being, okay, so you say this is a move that's a step in the construction of the c5 advance. I'm muted, by the way. I should check that. Okay, now black plays h4 and you play h3. Okay. Now, this is in the line. It's in the game where you're making the c5 advance. But we don't want to include these two moves when we have the condensed sequence that constructs the advance, or that is the advance. But it's not just that we don't want these moves, it's that we don't need to reference these moves to talk about why an advance can or can't happen. We can say if white has to play h3, then that's why the c5 advance hasn't happened, because if white had the tempo, if white didn't have to play h3, then white would be playing c5 instead. But that's that's not our mode of analysis. That's a different way of attributing time, a different way of spending time in analysis. So I'm saying that let me think. There are explanatory reasons, or there are characterizable, there are structural observations about the current impediments to advancing. It's not available because the pawn would hang. Okay, then play bishop back to e3, And now the pawn will still fall, but you can recapture. Okay, and I like that it's a bishop recapturing, because then you still have this kind of pawn structure advancing. Okay. Now what is my point? We're trying to talk about... Well, so if we could identify the impediments to making this advance, then we could remove them, or we could work around them. So if I say the impediment to the advance is that black has too much support, we could find other ways to provide counter support. Okay, and whichever other way, whichever routing we choose, we could look backward, condense the line, and say that these were these critical moves. These moves constructed the advance. And then we could say they constructed the advance by removing the impediments to making the advance or working around them. Now, it is only by a loose terminological association that we would say that this a4 move is an impediment to making the advance. It's not an impediment to making the advance in the same way that this pawn pressure is an impediment to making the advance. Broadly speaking, a4 poses an impediment to the c5 advance because it forces you to spend a tempo, but narrowly speaking, it doesn't pose an impediment according to our structural analysis. Mm-hmm. Why did I want this idea about the condensed lines? So this move, is this move like h3, or is this move... Would this move be included in the condensed presentation of the construction of c5? Would I need to include this move to observe white played this move as the first move of a sequence for covering one of these squares or making an advance into one of these squares? So, like, if the sequence turned out that white has to advance to b5 before making the c5 advance, now the knight was preparation for the c5 advance by allowing b5. And when we wanted to show the staging of this c5 advance, we would have a move, we would include this knight move. Okay, and now the other side of the board, anything could be going on over here. Any kind of, well, as in the general case, any kind of reasonable resolution of chess or unfolding of chess could be going on over here. If that doesn't incorporate, if it doesn't entangle pieces from the queen side, well, it's like saying, yes, we show the construction of this c5 advance, and then because those move, so in the condensed version, we're only going to have, we will be willing to skip move sequences that we say are not relevant, whatever that means, are not relevant on the queen side for the c5 advance in particular. Okay, now, practically, if we leafed through one of these move sequences, the queen side would jump, because whoever finds it advantageous to claim one of the tempi on the queen side would claim them. Chess would resolve over the sequence of tempi, and then once again we would be looking at a sequence move where white is preparing to play c5. So we would have jumps whenever moves were being made that didn't support c5. Now, this could be used to highlight something interesting, I think. Let's suppose we condense the c5 advance in the way I just described. Okay, so now we're leafing through the moves, and what we see is that the queenside activity is updating rapidly. The queen side of the board is updating rapidly. Okay, and that would mean that in the routing towards playing c5, either black or white, and then if white, presumably because of what black has done, either black or white sees that one of the available tempi on the queen side is best, then an off sequence unfolds, and then the next move in the c5 advance sequence, which may or may not be c5. And now what would the point be? Well, and this would be, we could use the extent of the kingside activity. We could use the extent of the kingside activity as a kind of clock or a metric for white's c advance. If, for instance, we thought that this advance is more persuasive when less activity has occurred on the king side, okay, then we condense the sequence, and between some move and the next, there's a seismic activity on the king side, much change. And then I guess we would be saying that black claims the advantage of shaking up the king side before white can get the advance in. Why do I want this idea of a condensed line? What makes me pick out a condensed line? I mean that ex ante I have the move sequence of a game, so I have the full record of a game, and now I'm going to group moves together into sequences. Okay, condensed sequences where I prune sidelines. No, not sidelines. Condensed sequences where I prune move sequences that involve pieces that are not relevant to my pruning. To involve sequences that are not relevant to my pruning. Hold on, let me think here. When I make a condensed sequence, I'm saying ex ante from a game, what I have is a line, a straight line of moves. Something motivates the placement of ... dots in the move sequence, where I cut out moves. If the moves are about pieces that I do not find relevant, I cut them out of the sequence. And then we're asking what makes me find pieces relevant for one of these condensed sequences. Well, I offer some characterization of the board state. And in order to offer that characterization of the board state, I have to reference piece distributions. And then, as it were, I retype my descriptions of piece distributions so that they constitute a commentary on the position. And this is an obfuscated way of saying that the motivation, well, it's like saying the motivation for selecting pieces out of a board state is syntactical and it's algorithmic. Because in order to provide the description I want of the game, I have to couch my description in terms of the piece distribution. Let me think here. And so that's where I start talking about structure, the idea of constructing, the motivation behind a condensed sequence is that I use the condensed sequence to depict a construction. And I do this by isolating what I call steps in the construction, or moves in the construction. They are the moves that deliver the pieces into the necessary positions to parry all of the difficulties in obtaining the objective. be a point about what I mean by a geometric intuition. Back here, bishop or pawn recapture. I merely felt that the pawn recapture would be preferable. I did not, when this appeared preferable to me, I did not notice, it did not strike me or occur to me that knight c6 through to e5, and knight is covered by pawn. But the pawn on d6 is part of the geometry of the position. The pawn on d6 and the factness that the pawn covers e5 is part of the geometry of the position. It's what we're having a geometric intuition about, as it were. Yes, and then for that matter, the knight is covering d4, which is the punishment for playing through. So you can't play the bishop here first to punish me for playing the knight through to e5, because up to the point where I play knight e5, you can't have played bishop d4. I guess this is a comment on the geometric intuition, which is about how the pieces look on the board. They look a certain way. Not merely the fact that piece positions are assigned a figurine, or there is a figurine in each piece position. So it looks, well, a shortcut to describing what the board looks like is to give a precise description of the figurines and then to say that the figurines are distributed across the screen. Okay, now the figurines look a certain way to the eye. They have, well, and we could say a geometric intuition is about space, and the way things look is the paradigmatic medium for speaking about extension in space. So the geometric intuition is about, well, so if we want the space-filling object, it's the figurine. It fills space. It's the substrate of our geometric intuition. It's what our geometric intuition, ostensibly anyway, is about. It's about the distribution of figurines. Though, more so, it's like my geometric intuition is encoded into hallucinated arrows or something. I encoded into patterns my eyes trace across the board. I know there's an overlap of facts here, like the figurines serving as also the symbol for rules, or the signs that we use to coordinate rules governing the pieces, and the rules governing the pieces I incorporate into my accounting for why my eyes move the way they do, why I look at things in the sequence that I do. when I want to explain why my eyes traced the path that they did across the board, I provide an accounting in terms of the piece activity, which involves gestures towards let me think. Piece activity. Actually, now that I'm looking at it, no, this was the move we selected, right? Well, so I said I had a geometric intuition that this recapture would be preferable to the bishop recapture. That geometric intuition was rewarded, as it were, through various follow-up observations, like how this is good. Whereas if I take with the bishop, maybe this is less good. It would be convenient for our argument if this was less good. Arguably, it's less good because we don't have access to c7, which is one of the more persuasive squares for the rook. Okay, and we have knight through to e5, and we have this coincidence. So now this will come with tempo against the dark squared bishop. Unless you spend your tempo defending it, now I have choice to pick up the bishop pair, but also... No, actually, no, that's not a problem yet. That might become a problem. So we have a geometric intuition. This maps to pieces. Well, it maps to figurine positions, which map to pieces, which map to line descriptions. Or to rule sets for pieces. And rule sets for pieces as the syntax, then we have higher level discussions, higher order discussions about well, the higher order discussions about chess, where you make condensed lines rather than merely representing the move sequence in fact, as it were. So we have a geometric intuition which maps to figurines, which maps to pieces, which maps to rule sets, or instead of rule sets, lines. The geometric intuition that told me this looks solid coincides with a fact of the matter. Is it solid? And then, as it turns out, the game delivers continuing observations that the position is solid. Or it doesn't turn out that way and I lose. I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. This idea of gravity. The gravity of the heavy pieces that makes... Well, it's like... Again, we want to talk about chess like it's a resource-based game, and then we want to say something like it's more efficient, it's cheaper to secure two heavy pieces at once with minor pieces than it is to secure them separately. So, like, if the king and the queen are still on their home squares, it is cheap to secure their positions with minor pieces, as opposed to moving the pieces, which is expensive. As opposed to splitting the heavy pieces, where if you want to accomplish the goal of defending both of the heavy pieces, you have to commit more minor piece moves because it's less efficient when they're split up. Now, instead, the description we carried forward, hopefully, was developing the minor pieces. We turned the king into a minor piece that we developed before the queen, as we develop all of the minor pieces before the queen. Okay, well, I think I'll call it there. Have a good one.